Now, the Great Depression and the Great Recession both proved Keynes. So the 1929 stock market crash turned into a disaster because the Fed did the opposite of what it should have. We had actually had other stock market crashes of similar scale in the past. There was one right after the end of World War I, and the government just did nothing, and it fixed itself really quickly. But with the 1929 one, the Fed panicked, but they didn't know what they were doing, and they went with contractionary policy instead. Literally the exact opposite of what Keynes would have recommended. Keynes hadn't written his book yet. This reduction in the money supply takes what would have been a bad day for a lot of people and turns it into a bad decade for everyone. And then in comes FDR, and he just throws fuel on the fire with all of his central planning. In comes Congress with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, throws fuel on the fire with their protectionism. The Great Recession, on the other hand, ended a lot faster. There were complaints in its day about the, recovery being sluggish, about there being a lot of long-term unemployment. But the Obama administration and the Federal Reserve, of the time, they responded with a huge stimulus, a huge bailout, a bunch of quantitative easing, and the recession went away. But the Great Recession also proved Hayek. See, the recession was caused by financial fraud. You had these scumbag banks who were making crappy loans, mortgages. They were making mortgages to people that could never pay them back. And this was partially by choice, and it was partially due to government pressure. This one is a little controversial. People argue about how much it mattered, but there was a government program. They were more or less forcing them to give mortgages to poor minorities on the grounds that it would be very mean if they did not. Folks that were never going to pay the mortgage off. So what do the banks do? Well, they take the garbage mortgages and mix them in with good mortgages, and they sell it as a bundle. So a bank can buy a mortgage from another bank, just like how you can sell bonds off. You're still making payments. It's just who you're paying, changes. Well, now the banks are selling, instead of, oh, here's Mr. Johnson's mortgage, do you want to buy it? It's, oh, I'll sell you Mr. Johnson and Mr. Taylor and Mrs. Smith's mortgages. And they come up with extra steps for it too. So they would start to sell parts of mortgages. I'll give you a 20% share in Mrs. Smith's house. And then they start to bundle the shares with each other. There's a very good movie, I've shown it in the past, called The Big Short, that explains a lot of this. There's this repeated process of like cutting things up more finely, mixing them in with others, until eventually the financial instrument gets so complicated that nobody has the time to read it. Nobody could even understand what they're looking at. You've got people selling things that include like 1/1000th of a house in California and 50 1/10 shares of homes in Dresden, Germany, and a shack in Zimbabwe, and so on. It's all bundled up into one purchase. And this was a way that they could kind of hide the low quality of the of the bad ones. Because if nothing else, that the good mortgages will outweigh the bad mortgages in the long run. But the problem is, as they keep doing this over and over and over again, it gets to where people were relying not on the merits of the mortgage itself, but on the credit rating that credit rating agencies gave to it. And the credit rating agencies were corrupt. They would rubber stamp anything that you bought them. Oh, here's, 50 mortgages in Detroit to unemployed people. Yeah, that's AAA right there. That's some good quality stuff. You ever had that problem where you bought something because it had like good reviews, but it it wasn't good when you got it? You ever notice that on some products on like online websites, the reviews are totally sketchy? It looks like the seller made the review themselves. They do that. Actually, we got a professor here, Bobber de los Santos. He's a cool guy, and he's done some work on that. Well, the problem got worse and worse, and you can think of it like systemic risk. The systemic risk in the housing market kept getting worse and worse. And traditional wisdom told people that housing prices always rise. And so, like any other bubble, because everyone just knew that houses were a good thing to invest in, people would buy houses and they would invest in companies that invest in houses without giving any thought to whether or not that particular house was worth buying. And bubbles always pop. And when the bubble popped, Daddy Federal Reserve came in and rushed to the rescue. And the banks got bailed out. The bankers were mostly let off with pay increases instead of, hangings like they should have. I had this picture of a golden parachute. If you don't know that term, golden parachute means a financial compensation in your contract where they just pay you to get rid of you. You might have a contract with a company. They're not allowed to fire you, at least not without certain conditions being met. But you're doing a really bad job and they really want to get rid of you. They're actually willing to pay you just to leave them alone. That's the golden parachute. Well, the government comes in, bails out the companies. A lot of the bankers, the like presidents, the chairman, the directors of these banks that were committing fraud, they pay themselves bonuses out of the bailout money, and very few of them ever faced any consequences. There was a handful that went to jail, went to prison. Most of them got a slap on the wrist, if that. And this caused the first major populist backlash of the 21st century. When I was a kid, populism was always presented as being a good thing, but it was also usually associated with the left wing. Especially it would come up with like Latin America and the French Revolution. Socialist populism. Because populism is not a coherent ideology. It doesn't advocate for anything. It's like saying demagogue. It means that you stand for the people against the elite. Well, what is the elite? That depends on the specific context you're talking about. What do the poor want? Depends on the context. Well, somewhere along the way, lost in the 21st century, populist became a snarl word for the American media. And it increasingly became associated with the right wing. Well, back in 2011, roughly. So the mortgage crisis starts in 2008. This lasts over a couple of years. There were two main groups that emerged. On the right wing, you had what was called the Tea Party, taxed enough already. They people liked to call them tea baggers, which to me, like that doesn't sound like a good, insult because I don't know if you teabag people in your video games anymore, but to me that just sounds like you dunked on someone in Halo or Call of Duty. Anyways, the teabaggers were opposed to Obama's stimulus bill. They cloaked themselves in this Boston Tea Party garb. They like to invoke the American Revolution in their symbolism. And they were very upset about the federal government spending all this money. And rightfully so. There was all kinds of ridiculous stuff in it. And on the left wing, you got what was called Occupy Wall Street. Now, these kids, they were kind of doing like the Gaza protesters now. They would go out and occupy like parks and stuff in New York City. They'd camp out there, strum their guitars like filthy hippies. And their main concern was the bailout part of the stimulus. So they weren't bothered by the stimulus, but they were very much bothered by the bailout because they felt rightfully that the bankers should face some kind of consequences for their actions. And one of the very sad ironies of it is that the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street, they hated each other. Your Occupy Wall Street, that was kind of like the heyday of Bernie Sanders, and they never quite went away. In some ways, I've never heard anybody say if they have a connection to modern Antifa, but that wouldn't surprise me. The Tea Party, on the other hand, they sort of presaged the rise of Trump some years later, after Obama was out of office. But these people, I remember, they hated each other at the time. But the irony of it was that they were closer to each other than either of them was to the elites of their own parties. What was the long-term outcome of it? Well, one outcome was that big media started mysteriously pushing culture and race war shit. Now, the financial crisis, it kicks off around 2008. Occupy Wall Street kicks off around 2011. Notice that spike. Now, some of this also just came from Trump, right? When Trumpist populism became a big thing. Wait, let me think. No, Trump was 2016, wasn't he? I am so old. That happens to me a lot lately. I just feel ancient anymore. It's my midlife crisis. So it's a big bummer when your midlife crisis hits and you're, still in your mid 20s. Anyways, yeah, Trump apocalypse, it kind of happens more near the middle of the decade. But your white supremacy, racial hierarchy, white privilege hysteria, it kicks off pretty much at exactly the moment that Occupy Wall Street starts. Huh. I wonder why. And Wall Street went back to doing the same crap they always had, just under a different name. They were calling these bad mortgages CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. Well, those were banned. So they just started trading CDOs, but they called them something else so that they weren't CDOs and therefore weren't banned. Your most recent example of Hayek being proven right, the Silicon Valley Bank. Some of you might have remembered seeing that in the news last year. Yeah, Silicon Valley Bank managed to waste its investors' money, goes under. What happens? California runs to its rescue. Get a bailout. This point here, I normally talk about it more in my Blair Mountain lectures, but there is a very long history of American capitalism using culture war to pit people against each other. In those lectures, I talk about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was making these very dramatic grabs for power. They had come back from extinction. They're running around lynching people. They're running around terrorizing people. They're doing it to whites just as much as to blacks. Whites that, were the wrong kind of white or wouldn't get with the program. And it eventually got so out of hand that you actually had white vigilantes running around killing Klansmen just to get the Klansmen to knock it off. They call this the nadir of American race relations. But at the same time that this was happening, there was also this huge wave of industrial unrest in American cities and the American countryside. There's people chucking bombs, there's unions rising up in revolts. There's you're having these big clashes where union men in the cities will go and like occupy public parks and stuff, and then the police just come in and beat the tar out of them. And the establishment at the time, progressive America, they were mostly aligned with the Klan. Well, one thing the Klan would do is the Klan didn't just promote racial hatred, right? It wasn't just anti-black stuff. It was also anti-Catholic. It was anti-Jewish. It was anti-communist, and it was anti-union. It was anti-worker. These Klansmen, anytime people wanted to unionize at a workplace, you know, the Klan was also mostly run by wealthy people too, not poor people. In the news, they always play them off as being like these dumb hicks, right? Redneck stereotypes. But usually your Ku Klux Klan chapters, they would start in the cities. They would they would be led mainly by business leaders, preachers, police chiefs. That's one of the reasons why they were able to get away with stuff, because it was people who were already politically powerful. But if a businessman had trouble with the Klan, or sorry, I mean, if a businessman had trouble with the unions, they would invite the Klan in to go protest, and they would rough up union workers. They'd intimidate them, and they would also try to convince white workers to essentially join them to focus on racial conflict instead of on economic issues. And in some places it worked, and in some places it didn't. You hear a lot about this thing called the Tulsa race riots, where a crowd of whites destroyed a very prosperous black town in Oklahoma, like wiped it out. But what you don't hear about is in the same year, there was this mixed race black, white, and Italian army that rose up against coal mining companies, had an actual shooting war with them, and ended up getting bombed from the air with biplanes. Same year. But they barely reported on it at the time, and they don't teach it in textbooks now. It didn't serve the interests of the elite to encourage or remember that, right? It didn't serve the interests of the elite to promote unity among people and opposition to corruption. Quite the opposite. In the end, so let's ask a big question. Who won? Who was right? I already told you, Keynes won the mainstream economics. You know, he was the god of economics for a couple decades in the mid 1900s, basically all the way up until around 1980. 1980 was when you get this big shift back towards free markets in the Western world. That's your era of Ronald Reagan. It's your era of Margaret Thatcher in Britain, Maggie Thatcher, milk snatcher. Uh, and, you know, the Soviet Union finally began to transition to capitalism, something that I'm going to talk about in Unit 4. Uh, these later economists, your Milton Friedman types, the Chicago school, just like how the Austrians were from Austria, the Chicago school is from Chicago. Clemson is a Chicago school program. A huge amount of our faculty are from Chicago, and they agree with what people from Chicago say. um, you know, they were much more opposed to federal intervention, but they still had some common ground with Keynes. They weren't completely against the idea of having a central bank. They weren't completely against the idea that the government might do some good by screwing around with the money supply. And these two different strains of thought, you're very interventionist, New Deal era, oh, we're all in this together, the government's going to save us kind of mindset of Keynes. And you're very libertarian, oh, the government's the devil and it's going to screw us mindset of the Chicago school. They end up merging. You end up getting something more nuanced than either of them on their own, and that becomes modern macroeconomics. As for the Austrian school, it never really hit big success in professional academia. I think more than anything, it wasn't their ideas that was the problem, but it was the whole attitude towards evidence. I used to be anti-Austrian myself because I just didn't know much about it. And when it's pitched to you as, oh yeah, my, if your evidence is my theories are wrong, your evidence is wrong. That doesn't sound credible at all. But there's a more sophisticated argument to be made. I just don't have the time to get into it. I'm still kind of exploring Austrian school stuff on my own. But it had a huge sway in popular economics. So like self-educated people, people that teach themselves out of books. If I run into someone at say a bar or on the street in a barber shop and they get excited when I mention being an economist, then usually they'll start chatting my ear off about how we need to go back on the gold standard, the Federal Reserve is satanic, and so on and so forth. This Austrian school stuff, it's very popular in, popular writing out of journals, outside of the universities. I can't give you an answer as to who was correct, but personally, I think both men were right. I think that Keynes was right for the big emergencies. When the world is on fire, we have to act. But I think Hayek was right on the little things. When you fix one problem, it sets up tomorrow's problem. You can't actually get rid of the business cycle. All you can do is just move it around. And in practice, this means we can use Keynesianism, but it has to be a true emergency. If we're ever misfortunate enough to have another Black Monday, we might have to bust out the Federal Reserve to take care of it. But for the little things of day-to-day life, COVID would have been a Black Monday if it wasn't for the government stepping in. The lockdowns caused the issue. The stimulus brought it to a conclusion. But we should have a great leeriness of using intervention. Well, that's all I have for you. In our next lecture, I'm going to give you a brief exposure to Marxism. Normally, like I've told you before, I like to teach this in the middle of the semester because I like to lecture on like the history of unions and that battle that I talked about. But it's just not fun over a video. So I'm going to fit it in here because you'll get Marx's like very brief explanation of his business cycle. And then as we talk about the effect of communism on long-term economic growth in Unit 4, you'll be able to understand, where these ideas came from. What was sort of the intellectual basis of communism? But I'll see you in the next one.